The story drifts into the quiet shadows of history, where the world once held its breath beneath skies darkened not only by night but by fear, hope, and the uncertainty of war. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine yourself standing in Europe in the late 1930s, when whispers of conflict turned into storms of marching boots and echoing sirens. The night air carried more than silence. It carried anticipation, worry, and the restless heartbeat of millions whose lives were about to change forever. This is the story of the Second World War, told gently, slowly, so you may drift into its chapters as if you were there, walking through its moments, but safe within the calmness of this tale. The war began with the rising tension after the First World War, a conflict that had promised to be the war to end all wars, yet left scars and grudges unresolved. Germany, under the rule of Adolf Hitler, stirred unrest across Europe with visions of conquest and speeches that lit fires in the hearts of some and fear in the souls of others. In 1939, the silence of uneasy peace shattered when Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war. The world once again stepped into the shadows of a global conflict. In the earliest days, life changed quickly for ordinary families. Picture a small home in London, where a mother pulled blackout curtains across the windows, ensuring no light would escape into the night. 4 enemy bombers sought even the faintest glimmer. Children clutched their toys while air raid sirens wailed in the distance. Fathers, uncles, and brothers joined long lines at recruitment offices, wearing fresh uniforms with pride, but leaving behind the warmth of home. Across oceans, in America, people read the newspapers and listened to the radio, uncertain if they too would be pulled into the storm. The skies soon thundered with planes, their shadows gliding over fields and cities. The Blitz rained fire over Britain. Families huddled in underground stations, the rumble of bombs above shaking the very ground. Yet in the midst of fear, there was resilience. In dim shelters, children sang softly. Mothers comforted them, and strangers became family for a night. The blackout sky was both a shield and a reminder of the danger above. Still, life carried on. Trains moved soldiers to the front lines. Farmers tilled their fields by day and prayed for peace by night. Far to the east, another empire was rising. In Asia, Japan expanded its reach, and in December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into the war. Suddenly, the conflict that had spread across Europe now spanned oceans. Soldiers from America sailed across waters, carrying letters tucked close to their hearts, letters that smelled faintly of home. The world was engulfed in fire, yet beneath it all, there remained the gentle rhythm of humanity, hearts beating, families waiting, lovers riding by candlelight. Imagine the streets of Paris, once filled with laughter, now under the stern march of occupying forces. Resistance fighters whispered in secret, passing notes, moving quietly in the dark, risking their lives for freedom. In forests and mountains, hidden camps sheltered those fleeing persecution. The Holocaust unfolded in unspeakable silence, yet even there, in the darkest hours, whispers of courage endured. Stories of escape, of survival, of people risking everything to save another, became sparks of light in a world shadowed by cruelty. On the front lines, soldiers marched through mud, snow, and sand. The deserts of North Africa echoed with engines and battles, while the frozen steppes of Russia became graves for thousands who braved the bitter winter. Yet, in the chaos of war, there were quiet moments. Soldiers sat by campfires, sharing bread, telling stories of their childhood, and dreaming of home. In the flicker of flames, they found comfort in one another, even as the world shook with conflict. Back home, rationing became a way of life. Families learned to stretch meals, to mend clothes, to give up luxuries. Women stepped into roles once held by men, working in factories, driving ambulances, and proving that courage knew no gender. Propaganda posters lined walls, reminding citizens that their sacrifices mattered. And in the stillness of the blackout nights, when all was quiet, people dreamed of peace. As the years passed, the war shifted. The tide began to turn, with battles fought in the skies and on the seas. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 marked a new chapter, as soldiers landed on the beaches of France under heavy fire, driven by hope that freedom would be restored. The waves crashed against the shore, mixing with the sounds of shouts and gunfire, but also with determination. Each step taken forward was a step closer to ending the long night of war. Through the exhaustion, the fear, and the heartbreak, letters remained a lifeline. A soldier in Italy opened a worn envelope, his hands trembling as he read words of love from his wife. A nurse in a field hospital tucked a letter in her pocket, one that reminded her why she worked tirelessly through sleepless nights. Words crossed oceans, carried by ships and planes, linking hearts separated by distance and danger. The Blackout Sky was a witness to it all. It hung over cities scarred by bombing, over villages where bells once rang freely, and over forests where soldiers lay in silence. Yet, in that same sky, stars continued to shine. They reminded the weary and the waiting that beyond the smoke and fear, there was still beauty, still hope, still a promise of dawn. The stars above glimmered faintly, as though they, too, were weary from watching years of conflict. Yet their quiet persistence mirrored the resolve of those who endured below. By 1944 and 1945, the world had reached a turning point. Armies that once struggled to hold their ground now pressed forward. Allied forces moved steadily across Europe, liberating towns and cities that had long been trapped under occupation. Each liberation carried its own mix of joy and sorrow. Bells rang again in villages where silence had reigned, and children peeked from doorways as soldiers offered chocolate and smiles. Yet behind the relief lay ruins, homes reduced to rubble, and families forever missing pieces of themselves. In the east, the Red Army pushed through forests and across rivers, their footsteps echoing through lands that had been scarred by some of the war's fiercest battles. The siege of Leningrad, which had lasted for nearly 900 days, finally broke. Families who had survived on scraps of bread and sheer determination stepped out into a fragile freedom. Entire generations carried the memory of winters spent in hunger. Yet they also carried a fierce pride that they had endured what once seemed impossible. The Western Front surged forward after the landings in Normandy. Soldiers pushed across France, through Belgium, and toward the heart of Germany. They marched not only with rifles, but with a sense of inevitability, the knowledge that the end of the war, though not yet here, was drawing closer. The Battle of the Bulge tested this hope, as German forces launched a desperate counterattack in the bitter cold of winter. Snow covered the forests where soldiers shivered in their foxholes, but despite the hardship, they held the line. When the battle ended, it was clear that Germany's strength was waning. even if the cost was measured in thousands of lives. Across the seas, the Pacific War burned with equal intensity. Island by island, Allied forces fought through jungles and beaches. The names of these places, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, became etched in memory as symbols of courage and sacrifice. Soldiers waded ashore under fire, clinging to the thought of home as waves crashed around them. In the Pacific skies, bombers traced arcs across the horizon, and naval battles decided the fates of entire fleets. For those who fought there, the war was as much against the elements as it was against the enemy. Heat, rain, and exhaustion weighed heavily, but determination carried them forward. Meanwhile, the Holocaust's grim truth came into the open as Allied forces liberated concentration camps. Behind the barbed wire lay scenes too harrowing for words. Silence where voices should have been. Shadows of lives once full of laughter and love. Survivors stepped into the light, frail but alive, carrying with them the weight of what they had endured. In these moments, the war revealed its darkest cruelty, but also its deepest reminder of resilience. Even when all seemed lost, the human spirit still clung to life. By 1945, the world leaned toward its climax. In April, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east and Allied troops pressed from the west, the German capital became the final battleground in Europe. Streets, once grand, now echoed with the thunder of artillery. Civilians huddled in basements, waiting for the storm to pass. In a bunker beneath the city, Adolf Hitler's reign ended in despair. His vision crumbling with the walls of the city he once promised would last 1,000 years. By May, the guns in Europe fell silent. Victory in Europe was declared, and across cities, scarred by bombing, people poured into the streets, embracing, singing, and crying. Yet beneath the celebrations lay the knowledge that the war was not yet over. The Pacific still burned. Japan remained unyielding, and the cost of every island fought for grew heavier. In the summer of 1945, a new and terrible weapon was unleashed. Over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, atomic bombs fell, their light brighter than the sun, their devastation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Cities were reduced to ash in an instant, and tens of thousands of lives vanished in the blinding flash. The war that had spanned continents and oceans, that had drawn in nations from every corner of the globe, now reached its end with a silence that followed the unimaginable. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan formally surrendered. The Second World War was over. Across the world, soldiers began their long journeys home. Some returned to the embrace of families who had waited faithfully. Others returned to empty chairs and quiet homes, the losses of war forever etched in their lives. Cities began to rebuild. Rubble was cleared, windows repaired, and laughter slowly returned to streets that had long been silent. For many, the war never truly ended. The memories lingered in the minds of veterans who dreamed of the front lines even years later, in the hearts of survivors who carried the weight of absence, and in the lessons etched into the world's conscience. Yet out of the devastation came something fragile but enduring, the hope that such a conflict would never again consume humanity. Nations formed new alliances, new institutions, and vowed to seek peace, even if the scars of war would never fully fade. And so, the blackout sky, which had once been a canvas of fear, became a sky of peace once more. Its stars still shone, steady and patient, watching over a world that had been broken but had also endured. Beneath their light, the world began again, carrying the memory of war, but also the promise of dawn. The streets of Rome were alive with noise. Merchants shouted their wares, from honey-dipped figs to bolts of dyed cloth, and the sound of sandals striking stone mixed with the bray of mules and the clatter of wagon wheels. In the heart of this bustling city, hidden among the stalls of olive oil and amphorae of wine, there was a marketplace that carried with it a weight darker than spices, heavier than gold. It was the slave market, the place where human lives were measured in coins. In Rome, slavery was not an exception. It was the backbone of society, a living machine on which the empire turned. From the grandeur of senators' villas to the humblest bakeries, slaves were present everywhere. But one question often whispered by modern minds comes back again and again. How much did a Roman slave cost? To answer this, we must walk through the streets as if we are there, listening to the language of buyers, watching the auctions unfold, and noticing how the price of a man, woman, or child was never fixed, but instead a reflection of their skills, their age, their beauty, and the ever-changing fortunes of Rome itself. At the slave market, the sun fell on a raised platform where men stood, their hands bound loosely with ropes. Above their heads hung wooden plaques inscribed with their attributes. A young man might have a sign declaring healthy, knows Greek, suitable for teaching. A girl's tablet might read trained in weaving, not prone to running away. The buyers crowded around, and soon the bids began. A strong field slave, broad-shouldered and young, might fetch 1,500 to 2,000 sesterces in the days of the Republic, though the exact value swayed with the harvests and the wars. To put this in perspective, a Roman legionary earned about 900 sesterces a year. Owning a single slave was therefore no casual affair. It was an investment, an outlay equal to several years' pay, but not all slaves were valued alike. Still, the marketplace was not just about numbers. It was about human lives being weighed against coinage. The air smelled of sweat and olive oil, of leather bindings, and the iron chains that rattled at ankles. Buyers tested teeth, pinched arms, and demanded to see scars. Some sellers offered guarantees. The slave proved defective. Within 6 months, he could be returned for a refund. In this grim economy, people were measured the way livestock might be, though many fetched higher prices than oxen. For slaves were not just animals of burden, but also vessels of skill, language, and culture. The cost of a slave in Rome also depended heavily on when you asked. During times of war, when Roman legions marched across Gaul, Hispania, and the East, captives flooded the markets. After Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, tens of thousands of men and women were sold into bondage. The sudden abundance drove prices down, so much so that, as one writer put it, a strong Gallic warrior could sometimes be bought for less than the cost of a mule. Yet in times of peace, or in years of famine, when supply waned, prices rose again. A Roman master with coin in hand had to consider carefully. Did he want slaves for hard labor, for domestic tasks, or for display? The cost matched the function. Field hands, miners, and galley rowers were cheaper, for their lives were expected to be short. Household slaves, trained in cooking, child-rearing, or managing estates, were more expensive, for their service was continuous and close to their master's daily existence. The rarest and dearest were those trained in specialized arts, physicians from Greece, teachers of rhetoric, or actors whose talents could delight a household's guests. These could cost sums so high that only the richest senators and equestrians could dream of paying. Beyond the marketplace, the story stretched wider. The empire itself thrived on this trade, and behind each price tag was an economy spanning continents. Ships sailed from Alexandria, Carthage, and Antioch, their holds carrying not only grain and spices, but also men and women taken in conquest. Merchants from Delos, once infamous as the hub of the Mediterranean slave trade, grew wealthy not from goods of luxury, but from human flesh. Imagine standing at such a market, where the voices of auctioneers rise like a chant. The clang of coins rings out as buyers settle their bids, and you watch as one man is purchased for the cost of a horse, while another is bought for the cost of a villa. The disparity is startling, yet it reveals how deeply woven into Roman life this system was. But numbers alone cannot tell the story. To understand the cost of a Roman slave, one must look at how their value reflected the needs, desires, and fears of their masters. Consider the gladiator. To purchase a slave trained for the arena was to buy both entertainment and potential profit. If the man fought well, his victories could bring fame to his owner. Such men were costly, sometimes fetching thousands of denarii, yet their lives were often as short as a candle in the wind. To own them was to gamble with death and spectacle. The cost also weighed upon the slave themselves, though not in coin but in fate, for a price could mean the difference between a life spent chained in the mines of Sardinia, where few survived more than a few years, and a life spent polishing marble floors in a senator's villa, where survival was longer, if not freer. A young girl sold for beauty might be spared the fields, but thrust into an existence no less suffocating, where her body itself was the currency exchanged. Over time, Roman law began to regulate these transactions. Sellers were obliged to declare defects, to ensure buyers knew if a slave was prone to running away, or if they suffered from epilepsy, or if they had been caught stealing. Failing to disclose such truths could lead to lawsuits. Even in the trade of human lives, Rome demanded order and legality. Still, behind the order was always the cruelty. Imagine a mother from Gaul, separated from her child on the auction block. The mother, strong and fit, might fetch a fine price for farm work, while the child, still young, might be sold more cheaply. The two would be sent to different households, their bond severed by the clink of coins. The cost of their lives was measured not in love or kinship, but in how many sesterces they could bring. As centuries passed, the value of slaves shifted with Rome itself. Under Augustus, as the empire stabilized, the demand for educated Greek slaves rose, for cultured Romans sought tutors for their children. In later centuries, as the empire's strength waned, the inflow of captives slowed, and prices rose again. Yet through it all, the trade endured, relentless, shaping the households, the farms, and the very identity of Rome. In the quiet of the night, when lamps flickered in villas, and city streets alike, slaves moved silently through halls, carrying trays of food, stoking fires, or guarding doors. Their masters might sleep, but their presence never ended. Each of those lives had been purchased at a price, whether for a handful of silver or for the fortune of a noble's purse, and each carried within them a story of where they had come from, of the chains that brought them here, and of the marketplace where their worth had been proclaimed to strangers. Roman slavery was not a static institution. The value of enslaved people fluctuated across centuries, shaped by conquests, agricultural booms, urban growth, and shifts in social taste. By the time of the late Republic, Rome's appetite for labor had grown ravenous, and the city itself had become a magnet for wealth. This demand was reflected in the slave markets, which operated openly and whose scale astonished even ancient observers. To walk through a Roman slave market was to encounter a world where human beings were displayed, inspected, and priced with the same scrutiny as cattle or horses. The very air of such a market would have carried the cries of traders, advertising strength, skill, or docility, while buyers murmured among themselves, weighing not just the cost but the usefulness of the lives before them. The basic pricing of slaves in the Republic and Empire fell along clear categories. At the lowest end, unskilled rural laborers, often captured in war or sold through debt, could fetch as little as 200 to 300 denarii in the 2nd century BCE, though inflation later shifted these figures. For comparison, a Roman legionary's annual pay around the early empire was roughly 900 denarii. This meant that a farmer might acquire a basic laboring slave for about a third of a soldier's yearly wages. These were the bodies destined for fields, vineyards, quarries, and mills. They were expected to endure rather than excel, and their price reflected this. But the Roman economy was not simply agricultural. As Rome expanded, its elite classes began to crave specialized slaves who could enhance comfort, prestige, or efficiency. This is where costs rose dramatically. A skilled craftsman, such as a metalworker, potter, or builder, could command prices several times higher than a field hand. Records mention sums as high as 6,000 denarii for artisans of extraordinary ability. Their owners knew that such slaves could generate profit through workshops, repairs, or construction projects, often surpassing the investment within a few years. Even higher were prices for educated slaves. Greek tutors, philosophers, doctors, and scribes were in immense demand. Roman elites prized Greek learning, regarding it as a marker of refinement, and the possession of a knowledgeable Greek slave conferred cultural capital. These intellectual slaves could cost anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 denarii, sums that placed them in the category of luxury items. They were treated with a strange duality, simultaneously enslaved and yet deeply influential within households, shaping the education of the next generation of Roman citizens. Cicero himself once remarked on the immense value of an educated Greek slave, hinting at the irony that Rome, conqueror of Greece, still sat at the feet of Greek tutors. Then there were slaves of exceptional beauty, particularly young women and boys. The Roman world, much like other ancient societies, commodified physical appearance. Those deemed especially attractive could be priced exorbitantly, sometimes more than highly skilled artisans. Erotic manuals and satirical texts suggest that wealthy Romans competed for ownership of beautiful slaves to serve both as status symbols and objects of desire. This darker facet of the system reveals how economics and exploitation intertwined. Beauty became another skill. In some cases, records mention sums reaching 30,000 denarii or higher for individuals whose looks or talents in entertainment, such as singing or dancing, were considered exceptional. At the very top of the scale were gladiators. The training, feeding, and purchase of gladiators represented a major investment. A healthy, strong male purchased for the arena might cost 2,000 denarii initially, but once trained in a gladiatorial school, his value could multiply several times over. A skilled gladiator who survived battles became an even greater investment, since his victories attracted crowds and wagers. Some star gladiators were so valuable that their owners insured them against loss, a fact that underscores how thoroughly human lives were reduced to financial assets. The highest prices for gladiators could surpass even those for learned Greeks, climbing to tens of thousands of denarii. Yet prices did not exist in isolation. They were shaped by broader historical forces. After major wars, such as the conquests of Greece, Carthage, or Galba, markets were flooded with captives, driving down prices temporarily. Livy describes scenes after Roman victories where tens of thousands of prisoners were marched into Italy to be sold. In such periods, even unskilled captives might be available for absurdly low sums, sometimes little more than a few hundred sesterces. Conversely, in times of peace, when fewer conquests brought in fresh captives, the scarcity pushed prices upward. Thus, the value of a slave was tied not only to their skills, but also to Rome's military fortunes. Another factor was age and health. Children, surprisingly, were sometimes more expensive than adults, not because they offered immediate labor, but because they could be shaped, trained, and acculturated to their master's household. A young boy destined for service might be considered a long-term investment with the potential to become a trusted steward or secretary. Healthy adults of prime age commanded strong prices, while the elderly, infirm, or visibly ill-fetched very little. The markets were unsightly. A limp, scar, or deformity could have a person's price. For a wealthy Roman senator or equestrian, to own 100 slaves was not simply about utility, was a performance of power. Wealthy households in Rome often had armies of slaves filling every role: cooks, doorkeepers, hairdressers, bodyguards, librarians, musicians, and even jesters. The extravagance reached such a point that some Roman authors mocked the elite for requiring dozens of slaves to carry out the simplest functions. To own many was to declare to the world that one had reached the heights of Roman society. Thus, the slave market was not merely economic, it was deeply cultural, a mirror of Roman values in which labor, beauty, and learning were priced, displayed, and consumed. We also find chilling glimpses into how sales were conducted. Slaves were often placed on raised platforms, with placards around their necks listing qualities: Greek, skilled in letters, or barbarian, healthy, strong for the fields. Buyers were allowed to inspect their bodies, ask questions, even demand demonstrations of skill. The Roman jurist Ulpian recorded laws requiring sellers to disclose defects, such as epilepsy or tendency to run away, much like modern laws about livestock or property. Fraudulent sales could be contested in court, showing how deeply integrated slavery was within Roman legal and economic systems. Behind every tidy record of prices lay human beings subjected to examination, stripped of dignity, and reduced to units of profit. The regional differences across the empire also shaped costs. In Italy, where elite demand was concentrated, prices were highest, especially for skilled or attractive slaves. In the provinces, particularly agricultural regions like Sicily or North Africa, demand focused more on field hands, and prices tended to be lower. The spread of markets across the empire created networks in which traders moved captives from frontier regions to wealthy urban centers. A Gaul captured in the north might find himself sold in Rome months later, his journey punctuated by chains and forced marches. Another layer was manumission, the practice of freeing slaves. For some owners, the possibility of manumission increased a slave's value, since loyal service might culminate in freedom, which in turn incentivized obedience. Some slaves even purchased their own freedom, saving wages peculiar given by masters. The price of manumission was often set according to the slave's market value, meaning that even the hope of liberty was tied to economic worth. A particularly skilled or trusted slave might be valued so highly that self-purchase became almost impossible, trapping them in a paradox where their very excellence ensured lifelong bondage. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored. For Romans, discussing the cost of slaves was not considered disturbing. Writers like Varro, Cato, and Columella included human beings in the same categories as oxen or plows when outlining farm management. They spoke casually of how many denarii one should expect to spend on a laborer, or how to calculate the expected yield from their work. To the Roman elite, slavery was simply an economic fact, woven into the very fabric of their society. Yet to us, looking back, the coldness of these calculations is chilling, for behind every price stood a story of capture, loss, and endurance. By the height of the empire, during the reigns of Augustus and his successors, the range of slave prices had become almost incomprehensible in its diversity. A cheap laborer might still cost only a few hundred denarii, while rare and talented individuals might command sums equal to estates. Records suggest that some emperors themselves paid staggering amounts for favored slaves or performers, amounts in the hundreds of thousands of sesterces. In these cases, the enslaved person was no longer just a worker or servant, but an ornament of prestige, a living treasure acquired to dazzle rivals. And yet, for all the wealth, for all the careful pricing and negotiation, the system was always unstable. Revolts broke out. Spartacus' rebellion in 73 BCE, being the most famous, when thousands of enslaved gladiators and field hands rose against their masters. Such uprisings were reminders that the reduction of human beings to property carried risks. Even the most expensive gladiator or the most educated Greek tutor remained a person capable of resistance. Fear of revolt haunted Roman masters, shaping laws, punishments, and even architecture, as houses were designed to monitor servants and fields patrolled by overseers. Ultimately, the question of how much did Roman slaves cost opens a window into the paradox of Roman civilization. It was a society that produced breathtaking art, architecture, and literature. The market stalls, the shouted prices, the carefully inked receipts, all of these were mechanisms by which Rome transformed conquest into wealth and people into property. To trace the shifting values of those sales is to glimpse the machinery of empire itself, vast, hungry, and unrelenting. The story of these costs is not just about economics, but about humanity. Every denarius recorded, every bargain struck, represented not just a calculation, but a fate. The cheap laborer bent over vineyards, the Greek tutor shaping a senator's child. The gladiator dazzling crowds under torchlight were bound by the same invisible thread of commerce. Rome's greatness was built on these transactions, and Rome's legacy cannot be separated from them. The figures echo across centuries, 300 denarii for a field hand, 20,000 for a philosopher, 30,000 for beauty, more still for fame in the arena. Numbers, yes, but behind them, voices silenced, hopes stolen, and lives reduced to price tags in the heart of the ancient world. Under the weight of Roman power, the life of slaves evolved into a cycle of necessity, cruelty, survival, and resilience that defined the backbone of an empire. By the time the Republic gave way to the empire, slavery was no longer merely an accessory to aristocratic luxury. It was the lifeblood of Rome's economic and social machine. Every street, every market, every forum, every military outpost whispered the presence of slaves, for they were the unseen foundation on which the empire stood. But how much did Roman slaves truly cost? And how were those costs measured, not only in coins, but also in sweat, in dignity, and in survival? In the thriving markets of Rome, buyers and sellers haggled beneath stone arches, the air thick with the calls of merchants and the smell of livestock, spices, and bodies pressed tightly together. A slave market was unlike any other. Men, women, and children stood on platforms, displayed like goods to be inspected. Prices varied according to skill, health, and rarity. A strong young farmhand fetched far less than a trained scribe fluent in Greek, and a beautiful courtesan selected for charm, wit, and appearance might cost more than a modest villa. A standard unskilled laborer might be purchased for 1,500 to 2,000 sesterces, a price within reach of a moderately wealthy landowner. But the truly skilled teachers, doctors, musicians, artisans could command sums so high they became status symbols, trophies of wealth and prestige. The cost of a slave was not merely an exchange of silver, it was an investment. Masters calculated whether the purchase would return more than it consumed. A farmhand might toil in fields, producing grain or olives worth many times his initial cost. A house servant eased the daily burdens of Roman matrons and senators, turning domestic life into a performance of elegance. A gladiator, trained in the harsh schools of combat, became a gamble. He might die in his first match, or live long enough to bring fame and fortune to his master. Each purchase, whether cheap or dear, was a calculation of risk and reward, as cold as it was practical. Yet the story of cost was not always stable. Wars shaped the markets as surely as rain shaped the fields. After Rome's great victories, tens of thousands of captives poured into the markets, driving down prices. Following the conquest of Greece, the empire was flooded with slaves, their numbers so vast that even skilled teachers and philosophers could be bought for relatively modest sums. But in times of peace or scarcity, when fewer captives were taken, the price of slaves rose again. Supply and demand, cruelty and conquest wrote themselves into the flesh of the enslaved. But cost was more than coin. A slave's worth was also measured in punishment and endurance. Runaways who were recaptured bore the mark of their disobedience, sometimes a hot iron branding their foreheads with the letters FUG for fugitives. Others faced lashes, shackles, or, in the most extreme cases, crucifixion along the roadsides, a grim warning to those who dreamed of freedom. The cost of defiance was as heavy as chains and as final as death. Still, within this harsh economy, slaves carved out slivers of humanity. Some were allowed to earn peculium, a small sum of money saved from tips, extra labor, or a generous master. Over years, a determined slave might accumulate enough to purchase their own freedom. The price of manumission freedom varied, just as their original price did. For some, it required years of toil. For others, a single act of loyalty might persuade a master to grant liberty without coin. And so the cost of freedom became another layer in the story of Roman slavery, hovering between hope and despair. Consider the bustling villas of Campania, where wealthy Romans lived in comfort. There, the price of slaves translated into polished marble floors, scrubbed daily, kitchens that never ceased to produce feasts, and gardens manicured by invisible hands. Every luxury enjoyed by the master was paid for by the labor of the enslaved. The mosaics that decorated the dining halls, the music that filled the air, the books that lined the shelves, each was touched, directly or indirectly, by the work of slaves. Their costs echoed not only in coins spent, but in the rhythms of daily Roman life. And yet, amid this system of exploitation, humanity endured. Some slaves became trusted advisors, their voices shaping the decisions of senators and generals. Others, like the famed philosopher Epictetus, born into slavery, left a legacy that far outlived Rome's might. Their stories remind us that cost is not only economic, but moral. What Rome gained in wealth and power, it lost in compassion, binding its greatness to chains of cruelty. The marketplaces tell only part of the tale. Beyond the clamor of auctions, slaves labored in mines, where the cost of their purchase was quickly repaid in grueling hours of toil. Here, underground, men and women lived in darkness, their lives often shorter than the fires that fueled the furnaces. The masters who bought them knew they would not last long. Their price reflected this grim reality. Disposable, they were worked until death, their cost calculated against the weight of silver or iron they pulled from the earth. In the countryside, slaves harvested olives, pressed grapes, and tended herds, their value tied to the cycles of nature. In the city, they swept the streets, carried messages, and entertained crowds. In households, they raised children not their own, whispering lullabies that might outlast their names. And in every corner of Rome, their presence was undeniable, their cost measured both in what they gave and what was taken from them. But what of the hidden cost, the toll upon Rome itself? For as much as slaves built, they also resisted. Rebellions flared, from small acts of defiance to great uprisings, like that of Spartacus, when thousands of slaves shook the empire to its core. The cost of quelling such revolts was staggering in blood and coin, reminding Rome that no chain was unbreakable. The Senate debated endlessly about the balance of fear and necessity, weighing whether the empire's dependence on slaves might someday unravel its strength. As the centuries passed, the cost of slaves changed again. Inflation, war, and shifting economies altered the markets. Masters sought cheaper labor in tenant farmers, while freedmen carved niches as artisans and merchants. Yet slavery never vanished. It remained the shadow beneath Rome's splendor, its true price written in the countless lives consumed by its demands. To ask how much Roman slaves cost is to open a window into an empire's soul. The answer is not only in sesterces and denarii, but in lives measured and discarded, in dreams deferred, in songs sung quietly in the night when the masters slept. Their price was counted in the stones of the Colosseum, in the grain that fed the legions, in the whispers of philosophers who once bore chains. And so, as history turns its gaze upon Rome, the cost of slaves remains one of its most enduring legacies. A civilization that celebrated liberty for citizens, but denied it to millions. An empire that rose on the strength of those who were bought and sold, their value tallied in markets, their humanity discounted in law. The cost, in the end, was Rome itself, for as surely as slaves built its greatness, they also revealed its deepest contradictions. Under the searing sun of North Africa, where the sands of the Sahara kissed the fertile plains around Carthage, an army prepared that was unlike any other. The Carthaginians, merchants of the sea and masters of trade, had long looked across the Mediterranean at their rivals, the Romans, with wary eyes. Their ships filled with goods from Spain, Africa, and the Levant, and their ports bustled with wealth. But they knew that wealth alone would not keep Rome at bay, and so they turned to something that would terrify their enemies, something that would thunder across the battlefield with unstoppable force: the war elephant. The elephants had long been a part of African landscapes, but Carthage saw them not merely as beasts of burden, but as engines of war. The African forest elephant, smaller than its Indian cousin, yet more aggressive, was captured in hunts led by skilled men who risked their lives to snare them. Imagine the scene: hunters driving herds toward pits dug in the earth, or toward thick ropes stretched taut between trees, hoping that the massive creatures would stumble, tumble, and be subdued. Once captured, they were broken not by kindness, but by sheer persistence. Carthaginian trainers, the mahouts, used iron hooks, fire, and deprivation until the wild spirit of the elephant bent to human command. Some elephants died resisting, but those that lived became instruments of war, fitted with heavy harnesses and trained to charge at the sound of horns and drums. When Rome first saw these creatures, it was said that many soldiers froze in terror. They had fought men, horses, and machines, but never such towering beasts with tusks sharpened and armor strapped to their sides. For Carthage, the elephants were more than weapons. They were symbols of power, moving fortresses that struck fear before the first blow had even landed. Yet behind their majesty was immense suffering. Elephants chained, forced into submission, marched across scorching deserts and treacherous mountain paths in campaigns that would test even the strongest armies. In the First Punic War, Carthaginian generals brought elephants to Sicily, their towering silhouettes casting shadows over Roman lines. At Panermus, in 250 BCE, these animals were driven forward, their trunks raised, trumpeting with rage. Yet the Romans, clever and adaptive, devised tactics that turned fear into strategy. They dug pits, lined them with sharp stakes, and lured the elephants in. They rained javelins upon the animals' flanks, igniting pain and panic until the elephants turned not against the enemy, but against their own ranks. In one horrifying moment, the Carthaginian line dissolved, trampled under the feet of its own beasts. The elephants, once thought invincible, became chaotic liabilities. But the story did not end there, for Carthage's most famous son, Hannibal Barca, saw in the elephant not only a weapon, but a tool of legend. When he swore to his father that he would never be a friend to Rome, he carried that oath with him into history, and elephants would march beside him into the heart of Italy. From the warm plains of Iberia, Hannibal gathered an army, and with it a train of elephants, each prepared for a journey no one believed possible. Across rivers, through forests, and finally into the frozen peaks of the Alps, Hannibal led his beasts. The Alpine crossing is remembered as one of the greatest feats in military history, but it was a nightmare of ice and death. The elephants, creatures of the savannah, struggled with narrow, icy passes. Snow blinded them, and food was scarce. Soldiers dragged logs and stones to build makeshift paths wide enough for the beasts to walk. Some elephants slipped, their massive bodies crashing down cliffs, lost forever in the white abyss. Others shivered, their thick hides unable to resist the cold, collapsing from exhaustion. Yet a few survived, and when Hannibal descended into Italy, those survivors brought awe to all who beheld them. Roman soldiers, already weary from tales of Hannibal's daring, now faced not just men, but the thunder of elephants at the head of his army. At the Battle of Trebia in 218 BCE, Hannibal unleashed his elephants against the Roman cavalry. Horses, terrified by the scent and sight of the beasts, reared and fled. Roman lines faltered, and Carthage claimed victory. In that moment, the elephants seemed to embody Hannibal's genius, using not only strategy but also fear as a weapon. Yet Hannibal's elephants, too few and too fragile in the Italian climate, would not long endure. Disease, cold, and lack of food slowly claimed them until only one, the great Surus, remained. Surus, said to be a massive beast with a broken tusk, stood as a living monument to the struggle. Hannibal, it is told, even rode him into later battles, using the elephant as a perch from which to command his men. Still, the elephants were never forgotten. Rome, though initially unprepared, learned quickly. They developed tactics to counter these monsters of war, opening their ranks to let the charging beasts pass harmlessly through, then attacking from the sides and rear. They trained their soldiers not to fear the trumpet of an elephant, but to face it with discipline. Over time, what once terrified Rome became merely another challenge to overcome. Yet for Carthage, the elephants remained symbols of defiance, brought forth in every major conflict. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Hannibal deployed 80 elephants, their massive bodies lined before his army as living walls of destruction. The ground trembled as they advanced, but the Romans, under Scipio Africanus, were ready. Trumpets blared, horns sounded, and the elephants, startled by the cacophony, panicked once more. Some turned, crushing Carthaginian soldiers, while others were channeled harmlessly through gaps left in the Roman line. Hannibal's gamble failed, and Carthage's fate was sealed. But the elephants lived on in memory, in the stories told by both victors and vanquished. To the Romans, they were proof that no beast, however mighty, could stand against discipline and innovation. To the Carthaginians, they were reminders of their once great power, of a time when the earth shook under their command. And to the world, they became legends, remembered not just as animals, but as warriors in their own right, pressed into humanity's wars. Even centuries later, the vision of Carthaginian war elephants lingered in the imagination. Roman writers spoke of them with awe, recounting how the sight of these beasts had tested the courage of Rome itself. And in distant lands, kings and generals who heard of Hannibal's march wondered what it would be like to command such a force of nature. Yet beneath the grandeur, there was always tragedy. The elephants never chose these wars. They were taken from their herds, ripped from their natural lives, forced to bear armor, spears, and men marched into foreign lands where they starved, froze, and bled. Their story was not only one of power, but also of suffering, a testament to the cost of human ambition. And so, the tale of Carthaginian war elephants stands as one of history's most unforgettable chapters. It is a story of courage and terror, of innovation and folly, of nature bent to the will of empire. It is a story where beasts became soldiers, where survival itself was a battlefield, and where the echo of their trumpets can still be heard, carried across the ages like a memory of thunder. The elephants pressed forward, their massive shadows stretching long across the stony earth as dawn broke over the battlefield. Carthaginian handlers whispered commands in a language of clicks, yells, and sharp iron prods, trying to steer the beasts into tight formation. These were no ordinary animals. They were war-forged giants, armored with plates of leather, their tusks tipped with bronze, their backs carrying towers where archers and javelin throwers waited. The Romans, facing them across the field, had never grown entirely comfortable with the sight. Even after years of fighting Carthage, the thunder of elephants was enough to stir dread in the heart of any legionnaire. The Second Punic War had brought the most famous of these moments, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps with his elephants. Though many had perished in the icy passes, those that survived stood as living symbols of defiance against Rome. By the time the Carthaginians marched into Italy, the elephants were more than war machines. They were legends. Farmers whispered of their approach. Soldiers recounted tales of men trampled beneath their massive feet, and entire villages abandoned homes at the rumor of their trumpeting. But elephants were both a weapon and a risk. The Carthaginian handlers, or mahouts, knew this better than anyone. If panicked, an elephant could crush friend and foe alike. In one infamous clash near the Po River, several elephants had turned wild after being struck by Roman pila, rampaging back through their own lines. The chaos almost cost Hannibal a victory. Yet, even in their unpredictability, elephants served their purpose. They broke the illusion of Roman invincibility. Soldiers who had trained for years in rigid formations suddenly found themselves facing a wall of flesh, tusks, and fury. Rome, however, was a quick learner. By the time battles reached deeper into Italy, Roman commanders devised countermeasures. They ordered gaps in the ranks where elephants might be funneled through, then showered with spears and arrows until they fell. At other times, they used loud trumpets, fire, or even pigs coated in pitch and set ablaze to terrify the animals. These crude but effective tactics chipped away at Carthage's advantage. For every elephant that struck fear, another fell screaming in pain, leaving behind a body too massive to move from the battlefield. Still, Hannibal understood their value beyond combat. The very presence of elephants in his army carried psychological weight. When emissaries from Italian towns came to negotiate, the sight of the animals tethered behind the Carthaginian camp reminded them that they were dealing with more than just men. They faced the living embodiment of foreign power. Rome had nothing like it. The Republic's strength was its discipline and manpower, but Carthage wielded a different kind of terror. Nature itself, bent to human will. Years later, when the war shifted back to Africa, elephants once again stood ready. At Zama, in 202 BCE, Hannibal brought nearly 80 elephants against Scipio Africanus. But by then, Rome had mastered its countermeasures. As the beasts charged, the Romans opened their ranks into corridors, filling the air with blasts of horns and volleys of missiles. Many elephants turned back, crashing through Hannibal's own troops. The Carthaginian line broke, and the war ended not with the triumph of elephants, but with their defeat. Yet their legacy endured. Roman generals spoke of them with equal parts awe and disdain, writing manuals on how to repel them while admitting the terror they inspired. Even after Carthage's fall, elephants lingered in memory, a reminder of a time when battles were not just between men, but between civilizations and the beasts they tamed. And so, in the annals of the Punic Wars, the Carthaginian war elephants remain larger-than-life symbols of power, of audacity, and of the thin line between control and chaos.